The twisted metal screamed against the morning wind as Marcus wiped hydraulic fluid from his calloused hands, staring at the wreckage that had materialized in his backyard like some mechanical angel fallen from grace. The helicopter lay crumpled against his workshop's chain-link fence, its rotors bent at impossible angles, cockpit glass scattered across the gravel like diamonds in the dust. Steam rose from the engine compartment, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning oil, and something else, something that reminded him of his father's garage 20 years ago, when hope still lived in the spaces between broken things. Inside the cockpit, barely conscious and bleeding from a gash above her left temple, sat the most beautiful woman Marcus had ever seen. Her pilot's uniform was torn at the shoulder, revealing a tattoo of wings that seemed to flutter with each labored breath. Her auburn hair, once perfectly arranged beneath her flight helmet, now cascaded around her shoulders like autumn weaves against fresh snow. Blood trickled down her cheek, but her green eyes remained sharp, calculating, assessing the damage with a professional detachment that spoke of military training and countless hours in the air. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Marcus called through the shattered windscreen, his voice rough from years of breathing engine fumes and swallowing pride. He'd learned long ago not to move accident victims without knowing the extent of their injuries, a lesson taught by his late father, who'd pulled more than one driver from burning cars in his 40 years as the town's only certified mechanic. The woman's eyes focused on him slowly, pupils contracting against the harsh morning light. When she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being heard above the roar of engines and the chaos of crisis. "I'm alive," she said, testing each word like a pilot running through a pre-flight checklist. "Victoria Sterling, Captain, Private Aviation. Aircraft registration, November 77, Alpha Sierra." She paused, pressing her fingers against the temple where the blood continued to seep. "I need to assess the damage, but I think I'm going to need some help." Marcus nodded, already mentally cataloging what he could see of the helicopter's condition. The tail rotor was completely destroyed, its housing cracked open like an egg. The main rotor blades were bent beyond repair, one of them buried 6 inches deep in his workshop's wooden wall. But the engine compartment, while damaged, didn't appear to be leaking fuel, a small mercy that might mean the difference between a repair job and a total loss. He'd seen enough crashed vehicles in his 35 years to recognize the difference between wounded and dead, and this machine was definitely wounded. "I'm Marcus," he said, moving carefully around the wreckage to find the best way to extract her without causing further injury. "Marcus Chen. This is my shop, or what's left of it after your dramatic entrance." He tried to keep his tone light, knowing from experience that humor often helped people focus on something other than pain. "I've got some medical training, nothing fancy, just first aid and common sense, but I think we should get you looked at by a real doctor." Victoria shifted in her seat, wincing as the movement sent sharp pains through her ribs. "The nearest hospital is 40 miles away, and I've had worse than this. What I really need is someone who can tell me if this bird can fly again." She looked at him with those startling green eyes, and Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. A recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the acknowledgement that his quiet morning had become something entirely different. The workshop behind them told the story of Marcus's life in oil stains and organized chaos. Tools hung from pegboards with the precision of a man who'd learned that time wasted searching was time lost earning. 3 pickup trucks in various stages of repair occupied the main floor, their hoods raised like mechanical flowers reaching toward the fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. In the corner, his father's old workbench remained exactly as it had been the day of the funeral, coffee cups still sitting beside the vise, reading glasses folded neatly atop a manual for a 1987 Chevy engine. Marcus had never moved those items, treating them like a shrine to the man who taught him that every broken thing deserved a chance at redemption. The town of Cedar Falls had seen better decades. Once a thriving logging community nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, it had slowly emptied as the mills closed and the young people moved away in search of opportunities that didn't involve sawdust in early mornings. Now it existed as a way station for travelers heading to the ski resorts 40 miles east, populated by stubborn holdouts like Marcus, who'd inherited their reasons for staying and hadn't yet found compelling reasons to leave. His shop served a 30-mile radius, fixing everything from farm equipment to the occasional tourist's broken-down sedan, charging fair prices to people who counted every dollar twice. As Victoria carefully extracted herself from the cockpit, Marcus noticed the way she moved, with the controlled precision of someone who'd trained their body to respond under pressure. Her uniform bore the insignia of Sterling Aviation, a company he'd heard mentioned in the same breath as corporate jets and wealthy clients. The helicopter itself, despite its current condition, was obviously expensive, the kind of machine that cost more than most people in Cedar Falls made in a decade. Yet here she was, crashed in his backyard, bleeding onto his gravel, asking him if her bird could fly again. "You said Sterling Aviation," Marcus observed, offering his arm for support as she stepped clear of the wreckage. "That's the outfit that flies executives around the Northwest, isn't it?" He'd read about them in the business section of the newspaper, one of those success stories that made regular people shake their heads at how the other half lived. Private jets, luxury helicopters, catering to clients who thought nothing of spending more on a single flight than Marcus made in a month. Victoria accepted his support gratefully, her legs steadier than he'd expected, but still trembling slightly from shock and adrenaline. "Among other things," she said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been resignation or disappointment, "we also do search and rescue, medical transport, emergency services. Not everything we do involves champagne and leather seats, though I have a feeling this particular aircraft is going to cost more to fix than it's worth." But Marcus was already walking around the machine, his trained eye picking out details that others might miss. The frame looked solid, despite the dramatic nature of the crash. The engine, while damaged, showed no signs of catastrophic failure, no seized pistons or cracked blocks that would make repair impossible. The transmission housing was dented but intact, and the fuel system appeared to have shut down cleanly, preventing fire or explosion. He'd worked on enough complex machinery to recognize the difference between cosmetic damage and structural failure, and what he saw gave him hope. "Actually," he said, running his fingers along a particular stress point near the landing skids, "I think you might be surprised. The bones are good. It's going to need new rotors, obviously, and the transmission will have to be completely rebuilt. But the engine—" He paused, listening to something only a mechanic's ear could detect. The subtle tick of cooling metal, the whisper of residual pressure equalizing, the absence of the grinding sounds that would indicate internal destruction. "The engine sounds like it might just need some attention and a lot of prayer." Victoria stared at him, her green eyes widening with something that might have been surprise or disbelief. "You're telling me you think you can fix a Bell 407 helicopter?" she asked, her voice carrying the skeptical tone of someone who dealt with plenty of overconfident mechanics in her flying career. "Do you have any idea what kind of specialized knowledge and equipment that requires?" "Ma'am, I've rebuilt everything from crop dusters to logging equipment, and once I even got a World War II-era tank running again for the Veterans Day parade. Engines are engines, and metal is metal. The principles don't change just because something flies instead of driving down the road." He gestured toward his workshop, where the evidence of his skills hung from every wall and filled every corner. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? It's already crashed." The laughter that escaped Victoria's lips was unexpected, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside and carrying with it a release of tension that seemed to transform the entire morning. The sound was musical, genuine, the kind of laughter that made other people want to smile, even if they didn't know what was funny. Marcus found himself grinning in response, struck by how different she looked when she wasn't concentrating on staying conscious or assessing damage. For just a moment, the corporate pilot facade slipped away, revealing something warmer and more human underneath. "You know what?" she said, wiping blood from her cheek with the back of her hand. "That's probably the most sensible thing anyone said to me in months. I am supposed to call this in, file a report, wait for the insurance adjuster and the company's preferred repair facility." She looked around at the rural setting, the modest workshop, the man standing beside her in coveralls that had seen better years. But something tells me that's not going to happen. Marcus felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition of possibility, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that sometimes the most important decisions are made in moments when conventional wisdom seems inadequate to the circumstances. "Well, I can't promise it'll look pretty when I'm done, but I can promise it'll fly. The question is whether you're willing to take a chance on a small-town mechanic who's never met a machine he couldn't fix." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the wreckage and illuminating the complex dance of possibility and uncertainty that would define everything that followed. In the distance, a meadowlark called from the fence post, its song carrying across the valley like a benediction. Victoria Sterling looked at Marcus Chen, and Marcus Chen looked back, and in that moment, something began that neither of them could have anticipated when they'd awakened that morning to what they'd thought would be just another ordinary day. But the most intriguing mystery lay not in the twisted metal or the complex engineering challenges ahead. It was in the way Victoria's eyes lingered on Marcus's hands as he traced the helicopter's damaged frame, and in the question that hung unspoken in the air between them. What had really brought her crashing into his life, and what would rise from the wreckage when they were done? The workshop smelled of motor oil and metal shavings, scents that had soaked so deeply into the walls and floors that they'd become part of the building's DNA. Marcus breathed these smells the way other people breathed fresh air. They centered him, reminded him of his place in the world, connected him to the long chain of mechanics and craftsmen who'd worked with their hands to keep civilization running. His father taught him that a man's workshop told his life story better than any biography, and Marcus's story was one of quiet competence, careful craftsmanship, and the kind of reliability that made people drive 50 miles out of their way when their vehicles needed attention. But today, with Victoria Sterling sitting on a folding chair beside the coffee pot, pressing an ice pack against her temple, and studying the helicopter wreckage through the open bay door, the familiar rhythms felt different. She'd insisted she was fine, had refused his repeated offers to drive her to the hospital, and had somehow managed to convince him to let her stay while he began his preliminary assessment of the damage. The way she moved spoke of physical confidence in training, probably military, judging by her posture and the efficient way she'd checked herself for injuries. Yet there was something beneath that competence, a sadness or disappointment that surfaced when she thought no one was watching. "Tell me about the crash," Marcus said, sliding beneath the helicopter's twisted belly with a flashlight and a clipboard. The frame showed stress fractures in predictable places, but nothing that couldn't be welded and reinforced. The landing gear had absorbed most of the impact, doing exactly what it was designed to do and probably saving both their lives in the process. Weather was clear, visibility good. What went wrong up there? Victoria was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if she'd heard the question. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with the accident. "Mechanical failure," she said simply. "Tail rotor started vibrating about 10 minutes out of Spokane. By the time I realized it was more than just turbulence, I had maybe 30 seconds to find a place to put her down." She paused, and Marcus heard the scrape of her chair as she shifted position. "Your workshop was the safest-looking spot within gliding distance." The clinical description told him nothing about what he really wanted to know: why she'd been flying alone on what appeared to be a routine cargo run, why her expensive helicopter had been suffering mechanical problems that should have been caught during routine maintenance, and most importantly, why she seemed more disappointed than frightened by an experience that could have killed her. Marcus had learned to read people the way he read engines, looking for the small signs that indicated larger problems, and Victoria Sterling was running rough in ways that had nothing to do with her head injury. 30 seconds, Marcus repeated, his voice carrying the respect of someone who understood split-second decisions under pressure. That's some fine flying, getting her down in one piece with that kind of warning. He emerged from beneath the helicopter, wiping his hands on a shop rag and making notes on his clipboard. The tail rotor housing shows signs of metal fatigue, probably been developing hairline cracks for weeks. Whoever's been doing your maintenance inspections missed something important. The expression that crossed Victoria's face was complex, part vindication, part anger, and part something that looked like relief at having her suspicions confirmed. I've been telling the maintenance supervisor for months that something felt wrong during pre-flight checks. Subtle vibrations, slightly longer spool-up times, responses that felt just a fraction off from normal. But the computer diagnostics kept showing green across the board, and the company was more interested in keeping the bird in the air than grounding it for what might have been pilot intuition. Marcus nodded, understanding the familiar tension between human instinct and corporate efficiency. He'd seen it countless times. Drivers who knew something was wrong with their vehicles but were told by dealership service departments that everything was fine, only to find themselves stranded on highways when minor problems became major failures. The difference was that when a car broke down, people didn't fall out of the sky. "How long have you been flying?" he asked, genuinely curious about the woman who'd literally dropped into his morning. 15 years, Victoria said, unconsciously straightening her shoulders in a way that suggested military bearing. Started in the Army, flying medical evacuation missions in Afghanistan. 2 tours, then came home and discovered that civilian helicopter pilots are about as common as unicorns and twice as expensive to insure. She managed to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Sterling Aviation was supposed to be different. Small company, family-owned, focused on service rather than just profit margins. At least that's what I thought when I signed on 3 years ago. The bitterness in her voice told Marcus there was more to that story, layers of disappointment and disillusionment that went deeper than simple employment dissatisfaction. He'd heard similar tones from customers who'd been let down by people they'd trusted, mechanics who'd cut corners, employers who'd made promises they didn't keep, family members who'd chosen money over loyalty. The workshop had become an unofficial counseling center over the years, a place where people felt safe enough to voice their frustrations while he worked on their mechanical problems. "Let me guess," Marcus said, settling onto an upturned crate and giving Victoria his full attention. "The family-owned company got bought out by some corporate entity that promised nothing would change. And everything changed." It was a story he'd heard dozens of times, the way small businesses got swallowed by larger ones, how personal relationships became spreadsheet entries, how craftsmanship got sacrificed for quarterly profit reports. Victoria's laugh was short and bitter. Exactly. Except in this case, the family sold out to their own son, who decided that his MBA knew more about aviation than 3 generations of actual flying experience. She shifted in her chair, wincing slightly as the movement jarred her ribs. David Sterling, fresh out of business school, full of ideas about efficiency and cost-cutting and maximizing shareholder value. Never mind that some of us actually care about keeping people alive up there. The pieces were starting to fit together in Marcus's mind. The mechanical failure that had been ignored, the obvious tension between pilot intuition and management priorities, the way Victoria seemed more angry than grateful to have survived a potentially fatal accident. He'd seen similar patterns in his own industry, where corporate ownership gradually squeezed the humanity out of businesses that had once operated on handshakes and personal relationships. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about how insurance companies and corporate aviation handled situations like this. Do they write off the helicopter, fire you for crashing it, or pretend the whole thing never happened? Victoria was quiet for a moment, staring at the wreckage with an expression that combined professional assessment with personal grief. "Honestly, I'm not sure I care anymore," she said finally. "I've been thinking about making a change for months, but this morning kind of forced the issue." She looked at Marcus directly,
her green eyes holding his gaze with uncomfortable intensity. "Can I ask you something? Do you ever feel like you're wasting your life?" The question caught Marcus off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it hit too close to concerns he'd been wrestling with for years. He looked around his workshop, at the familiar tools and ongoing projects, at the photographs of completed restorations covering one wall, at the coffee-stained desk where he managed the business side of his one-man operation. It was a good life, honest work that served his community and honored his father's memory, but lately, especially during the quiet evening hours when the day's work was done, he'd found himself wondering what else might be possible. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of years of unexamined assumptions. "I mean, this is good work, necessary work, and I'm good at it. But sometimes I wonder if being good at something is reason enough to spend your whole life doing it." He paused, surprised by his own honesty. "What about you? Flying helicopters seems like the kind of job most people would consider pretty exciting." Victoria smiled, but it was a sad expression. "It used to be. Back when I was pulling wounded soldiers out of combat zones, or helping with search and rescue operations, or flying medical supplies to places regular aircraft couldn't reach, that felt like it mattered. But corporate aviation? Let's just say there's not much nobility in flying rich people to golf tournaments and board meetings." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel, as Mrs. Patterson's ancient Ford pickup turned into the driveway. Marcus's elderly neighbor emerged from the truck carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the expression of someone who'd spotted something unusual from her kitchen window and had come to investigate. At 73, Eleanor Patterson had lived in Cedar Falls long enough to consider herself personally responsible for monitoring everything that happened within a 2-mile radius of her house. "Morning, Marquez," she called, her sharp blue eyes immediately fixing on Victoria with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "I couldn't help but notice you had some excitement over here earlier. Hope nobody was hurt." The statement was phrased as concern, but Marcus recognized it as the opening move in what would become a comprehensive interrogation designed to extract every available detail about the morning's events. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Victoria Sterling," Marcus said, rising to perform introductions with the courtesy his father had drilled into him. "Her helicopter had some mechanical troubles and she had to make an emergency landing. Victoria, this is my neighbor Eleanor Patterson, who makes the best strawberry jam in 3 counties and knows everything that happens in Cedar Falls before it actually happens." Eleanor's expression softened slightly at the compliment, but her reporter's instincts remained sharp. "Helicopter, you say? Well, that explains the noise that woke me up at 7:30. Sounded like the world was coming to an end." She studied Victoria with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to reading character in facial expressions and body language. "You're not hurt too badly, I hope. That's quite a nasty cut on your forehead." "I'm fine, thank you," Victoria replied, instinctively touching the bandage Marcus had applied. "Just a minor bump. Marcus has been very kind, letting me rest here while we figure out what to do about the helicopter." Eleanor's eyes sharpened with interest. "Oh, so you're planning to fix it? That's ambitious, even for you, Marcus." She looked between the two of them with an expression that suggested she was already composing the stories she'd tell at the grocery store and post office. "How long is that likely to take?" Marcus found himself caught between honesty and discretion, aware that anything he said would be transmitted throughout Cedar Falls within hours. "Hard to say until I get a better look at the damage," he said carefully. "Could be a few days, could be a few weeks. Depends on what parts I can find and how complex the repairs turn out to be." "A few weeks," Victoria repeated, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been panic or anticipation. "I can't stay here for a few weeks. I have responsibilities, commitments, a job that probably won't exist much longer if I don't get back soon." But even as she protested, Marcus noticed that she didn't sound entirely disappointed by the prospect of an extended stay. There was something in her voice, relief, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity about what it might feel like to step away from the pressures that had been defining her life. He'd heard similar tones from customers who'd been forced by circumstances to slow down, to reconsider their priorities, to discover that the world didn't end when they stopped running at full speed. Eleanor's expression had shifted to something approaching maternal concern. "Well, you can't very well leave without your helicopter," she pointed out with practical logic. "And if you're going to be staying in Cedar Falls for a while, you'll need a place to stay. The motel closed down last year, but I've got that guest room upstairs that never gets used." She looked at Victoria with a directness that invited no argument. "It's got its own bathroom, a view of the mountains, and it's close enough that you can walk over here to check on Marcus's progress." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, to explain why that wouldn't work, to list all the reasons she needed to get back to her regular life as quickly as possible. But something in Eleanor's expression, a combination of genuine kindness and steely determination, seemed to deflate her objections before she could voice them. Marcus recognized the look. He'd been on the receiving end of Eleanor's maternal instincts countless times over the years, and had learned that resistance was not only futile, but ultimately unnecessary. Eleanor Patterson had never offered help that wasn't genuinely meant and practically useful. "That's very kind of you," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying a note of surrender that didn't sound entirely unhappy. "But I should probably call my company, let them know what happened, see what they want me to do about the situation." "Of course," Eleanor agreed. "But there's no point in making any hasty decisions when you've just been through a traumatic experience. A day or two of rest never hurt anybody, and it'll give Marcus time to get a proper assessment of the damage." She fixed Marcus with a look that clearly indicated she expected his cooperation in this plan. "Won't it, Marcus?" Marcus found himself nodding, caught up in the strange momentum of the morning, and increasingly curious about what might develop if Victoria Sterling stayed in Cedar Falls long enough for him to get to know her beyond the circumstances of their dramatic introduction. "Makes sense to me," he heard himself saying. "These things take time to do right, and rushing usually just leads to bigger problems down the road." As the three of them stood there in the morning sunlight, surrounded by the wreckage of Victoria's helicopter and the orderly chaos of Marcus's workshop, something shifted in the air between them. A recognition of possibility, perhaps. Or simply the acknowledgement that sometimes the most important journeys begin with unplanned detours. The question that hung unspoken was whether Victoria Sterling was ready to discover what might be waiting for her in the spaces between her old life and whatever came next. The first sign of trouble arrived 3 days later in the form of a black SUV with tinted windows that pulled into Marcus's driveway like a mechanical storm cloud. Victoria, who had been helping him inventory the helicopter's damaged components while wearing one of Eleanor's floral aprons over her flight suit, immediately stiffened at the sight of the vehicle. Marcus noticed how her entire demeanor changed, shoulders squaring, jaw setting, hands unconsciously clenching into fists as if preparing for confrontation. "Company?" Marcus asked, though the single word carried enough inflection to indicate he already suspected this wasn't a social visit. He'd been in business long enough to recognize the particular brand of aggressive professionalism that arrived in expensive vehicles and left ordinary people feeling smaller than they'd felt before. "David Sterling," Victoria said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who'd been dreading this moment since the morning of the crash. "My boss. Well, technically the owner's son, but he's been running operations for the past year." She untied Eleanor's apron with sharp, precise movements that spoke of barely controlled anger. "I called in the accident report yesterday, but I figured I had at least a week before anyone showed up to assess the situation." The man who emerged from the SUV looked exactly like what Marcus had expected. Mid-30s, expensive suit, the kind of haircut that cost more than most people spent on groceries, and the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never had to wonder where his next paycheck was coming from. David Sterling moved with the predatory efficiency of a corporate shark, his eyes immediately cataloging and dismissing the rural setting, the modest workshop, and Marcus himself before fixing on the helicopter wreckage with the calculating gaze of someone mentally calculating insurance claims and liability issues. "Victoria," David said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a practiced manipulator. "Thank God you're all right. When we got your report, I was terrified we'd lost our best pilot." The words sounded like they'd been rehearsed, delivered with just enough emotion to seem genuine, without actually committing to any real concern. Victoria's response was coolly professional. "David, I wasn't expecting you so soon. I told Sarah I'd have a preliminary damage assessment by the end of the week." She gestured toward Marcus, who was wiping his hands on a shop rag and preparing for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. "This is Marcus Chen. He's the mechanic who's been helping me evaluate the helicopter's condition." David's handshake was precisely calibrated, firm enough to assert dominance, brief enough to indicate he had more important places to be. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate you helping Victoria, but I think we can take things from here." His smile was professionally pleasant and completely without warmth.
Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, the familiar sensation of being dismissed by people who assumed that expensive suits and corporate credentials automatically trumped years of experience and proven competence. He'd encountered David Sterling's type before, usually in the form of insurance adjusters and dealership service managers who treated independent mechanics like obstacles to be overcome, rather than professionals whose opinions might have value. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned not to be intimidated by other people's attempts to diminish him, "Victoria and I have been discussing the possibility of handling the repairs here. I've worked on aircraft before, and the damage isn't as extensive as it initially appeared." David's expression shifted to something approaching incredulity, as if Marcus had just suggested performing brain surgery with a socket wrench. "Mr. Chan, I'm sure you're very competent at what you do, but this is a $12 million aircraft with sophisticated avionics and engineering systems that require specialized knowledge and certified repair facilities." His tone had sharpened, taking on the condescending edge of someone explaining why peasants shouldn't handle the fine china. "Our insurance company requires all repairs to be performed by FAA-certified facilities with proper documentation and warranty guarantees." Victoria stepped forward, her body language indicating she was prepared to enter what appeared to be an inevitable battle. "David, before you make any final decisions, you should know that Marcus has identified the root cause of the mechanical failure. Metal fatigue in the tail rotor assembly, exactly what I've been reporting for months." Her voice carried the controlled anger of someone who'd been vindicated at too high a cost. The kind of fatigue that should have been caught during routine maintenance inspections. The silence that followed was charged with implications that went far beyond a simple disagreement about repair procedures. Marcus could see David's mental calculations shifting, processing the liability issues and potential lawsuits that could arise if the company's maintenance procedures were found to be inadequate. This was no longer just about where the helicopter got fixed. This was about who might be held responsible for a near-fatal accident that could have been prevented. "That's a serious accusation, Victoria," David said finally, his voice losing its false warmth and taking on the harder edge of someone who'd been backed into a corner. "Our maintenance department follows all FAA regulations and industry best practices. If there was a mechanical failure, it was due to normal wear and operational stress, not negligence on our part." Marcus had remained silent during this exchange, but something in David's tone triggered his protective instincts. He'd spent his career watching corporate entities blame their failures on everyone except themselves, and he'd recognized the familiar pattern of deflection and responsibility avoidance. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd examined the evidence firsthand, "the fracture patterns in the tail rotor housing indicate progressive failure over several months. The kind of thing that shows up clearly on magnetic particle inspection if anyone bothers to look." David's attention snapped to Marcus with laser focus. "Are you suggesting our maintenance department is incompetent, Mr. Chen? Because that's a claim that could have significant legal implications for everyone involved." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of corporate intimidation designed to silence inconvenient voices before they could cause expensive problems. But Marcus had dealt with bullies before, and he'd learned that the best response was usually calm, factual honesty delivered without defensiveness or aggression. "I'm not suggesting anything," he said evenly. "I'm telling you what the physical evidence shows. If that creates problems for your company, maybe the solution is better maintenance procedures, not shooting the messenger." The tension in the workshop had become thick enough to cut with a knife. Victoria was watching the exchange with the intensity of someone whose future hung in the balance, while David was clearly recalculating his approach in light of Marcus's unexpected refusal to be intimidated. Marcus himself was surprised by his own boldness, but something about Victoria's situation had triggered his protective instincts in ways he didn't entirely understand.
The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor Patterson, who appeared in the workshop doorway carrying a tray with 3 cups of coffee and her legendary chocolate chip cookies. Her timing was either miraculous or the result of having monitored the conversation from her kitchen window, and her presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room. Eleanor had a gift for diffusing tension through the simple expedient of refusing to acknowledge it existed. "I thought you gentlemen might need some refreshment," she said, her voice carrying the cheerful authority of someone accustomed to having her hospitality accepted without question. "And you must be Victoria's employer. I'm Eleanor Patterson, Marcus's neighbor." She set the tray down on Marcus's workbench and fixed David with the kind of smile that managed to be both welcoming and somehow threatening. "I hope you're not here to cause problems for Victoria. She's been through quite enough already." David's corporate armor seemed to develop cracks in the face of Eleanor's maternal directness. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm just here to ensure that our employee receives proper care and that company property is handled appropriately." His voice had lost some of its aggressive edge, apparently disarmed by the unexpected appearance of cookies and coffee in the middle of what had been shaping up as a corporate confrontation. "Well, of course you are," Eleanor said, her tone suggesting she found this explanation perfectly reasonable, while somehow making it clear she didn't believe a word of it. "Victoria's been staying in my guest room, you know. Lovely girl, though I think she's been working much too hard for much too long. Sometimes it takes a crisis to help people realize they need to slow down and reassess their priorities." Victoria was watching this exchange with barely concealed amazement, clearly unaccustomed to having anyone advocate for her well-being without obvious ulterior motives. Marcus recognized the look. It was the same expression he'd seen on customers' faces when he explained that their repair bills were going to be less than they had expected, or when he went out of his way to accommodate their scheduling needs. People who dealt primarily with corporate entities often seemed surprised by simple human kindness. "Mrs. Patterson is right about one thing," Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of newfound determination. "I have been working too hard for too long, and maybe this accident is exactly the wake-up call I needed." She looked directly at David, her green eyes holding his gaze with uncomfortable intensity. "I've been thinking about my future with Sterling Aviation, and I'm not sure it's what I want anymore." David's expression shifted to something approaching panic, the look of someone whose carefully laid plans had suddenly encountered an unexpected variable. "Victoria, you're our most experienced pilot. The company depends on your skills and professionalism. I'm sure we can work out whatever issues you might be having." His voice had taken on the desperate edge of someone trying to prevent a valued asset from walking away. "The issue," Victoria said, her voice steady but carrying years of accumulated frustration, "is that I became a pilot to help people, not to ferry rich people around like an airborne taxi service. The issue is that when I report safety concerns, they get ignored until someone nearly dies. The issue is that I'm tired of being treated like a replaceable part in your profit machine." David's face flushed red, his corporate composure finally cracking under the weight of Victoria's accusations. "That's completely unfair, Victoria. We have invested thousands of hours in your training, provided you with state-of-the-art equipment, giving you opportunities that most pilots would kill for. And this is how you repay that investment? By bad-mouthing the company to some small-town mechanic?" Marcus felt his own temper beginning to rise at being dismissed as some small-town mechanic, but before he could respond, Eleanor stepped smoothly into the breach. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice carrying the steel-wrapped-in-silk tone she used when neighborhood children needed correction, "I think you might want to reconsider how you speak to people. Victoria has just survived what could have been a fatal accident, and Marcus has been nothing but helpful and professional. Perhaps this conversation would be more productive if everyone focused on solutions rather than accusations. The rebuke hit David like a physical blow, and Marcus could see him struggling to regain his corporate footing in the face of Eleanor's inassailable moral authority. But before he could formulate a response, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the workshop, the rumble of diesel engines and the hiss of air brakes that indicated serious machinery was arriving.
"That'll be the recovery team," David said, his voice carrying a note of relief at having reinforcements arrive. "They'll have the helicopter loaded and on its way to Seattle within a couple of hours." He looked at Victoria with the expression of someone playing what he clearly believed was a winning card. "After which, you can take a few days to recover from your ordeal, and then we can discuss your future with the company like rational adults." But Victoria was already shaking her head, her expression hardening with resolve. "No, David, I don't think so. I think the helicopter stays here, and Marcus gets a chance to prove what he can do with it." She looked at Marcus, her green eyes holding his gaze with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. "If you're willing to take on the project, that is. I know it's a big risk, and there's no guarantee the insurance company will approve the work." Marcus felt the weight of the moment settling around him like a mantle. This was more than just a repair job. This was Victoria's declaration of independence from a system that had failed her, and his acceptance would make him a participant in whatever came next. He could play it safe, step aside, let the corporate machinery handle things the way it always did, or he could trust his skills, his instincts, and the growing certainty that Victoria Sterling was worth fighting for. "I'm willing," he said, simply, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd never backed down from a challenge that mattered. "But you need to understand that once I start taking that machine apart, there's no going back. If the insurance company or your employer decides they don't like what I'm doing, you could end up responsible for a $12 million loss." Victoria's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face and filling the workshop with warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sunshine streaming through the windows. "Then I guess we'd better make sure you do it right," she said, her voice carrying a note of exhilaration that spoke of bridges being burned and new paths being chosen. David was staring at both of them as if they'd just announced their intention to attempt flight by flapping their arms. "Victoria, you can't be serious. You're talking about career suicide. No reputable aviation company will hire a pilot who's been involved in unauthorized repairs on company equipment." His voice carried the desperate edge of someone watching a carefully constructed plan collapse in real time. "Maybe," Victoria replied, her voice steady and surprisingly calm. "Maybe it's time I stopped letting other people define what my career should look like." She gestured toward the helicopter wreckage, then toward Marcus's workshop with its evidence of skilled craftsmanship and honest work. "Maybe it's time I started trusting people who actually care about doing things right, instead of just doing them profitably." The recovery team that emerged from the convoy of trucks was exactly what Marcus had expected. Efficient professionals with expensive equipment and the kind of casual arrogance that came from handling million-dollar machinery on a daily basis. Their team leader, a barrel-chested man named Rodriguez, took one look at the helicopter's position and began calculating crane angles and lifting points with the practiced eye of someone who'd extracted aircraft from far more challenging locations. "Shouldn't be too complicated," Rodriguez announced after completing his initial assessment. "We'll have the main body lifted and loaded within 2 hours, rotors and smaller components packed separately for transport." He looked at David with the expression of someone waiting for authorization to proceed. "Standard recovery fee plus transport to Seattle, everything documented for insurance purposes." But David was no longer looking like someone in control of the situation. Victoria's declaration of independence had clearly caught him off guard, and he was struggling to adapt to circumstances that weren't following his predetermined script. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there earlier, "there might be some changes to the recovery plan. I need to make some phone calls, consult with our legal department about the best way to proceed." Rodriguez's expression shifted to something approaching irritation. "Sir, with respect, we've got 3 other jobs scheduled this week, and my crew's time is billable whether we're working or waiting.
If you want to postpone the recovery, that's your decision, but you're still responsible for the mobilization costs and standby time. Marcus watched this exchange with growing amazement at how quickly corporate efficiency could deteriorate when faced with unexpected variables. David Sterling, who'd arrived radiating confidence and authority, was now trapped between Victoria's refusal to cooperate, Marcus's unwillingness to be intimidated, and a recovery team that operated on expensive schedules that didn't accommodate indecision. "There's another option," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the growing tension with the clarity of someone who'd found her footing in the chaos. "The helicopter could stay here while Marcus conducts his assessment. If his evaluation shows the damage is beyond economical repair, then Northwest Aviation Recovery can handle the transport to a salvage facility. If the damage is repairable, we proceed with the work here." David stared at her as if she just suggested they paint the helicopter pink and use it as a lawn ornament. "Victoria, that's not how corporate aviation works. We have protocols, procedures, insurance requirements, regulatory compliance issues. You can't just decide to have a $12 million aircraft repaired in someone's backyard workshop." But Marcus was already stepping forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent his career making the impossible seem routine. "Actually, you can. I'm a certified A&P mechanic with inspection authorization for both power plant and airframe work. My shop is licensed for aircraft maintenance and repair, and all my work meets or exceeds FAA standards." He looked directly at David, his expression calm but unyielding. "The question isn't whether I'm qualified to do the work. The question is whether you're willing to give someone outside your corporate bubble a chance to prove what small-town competence can accomplish." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that went beyond simple business decisions. This had become a test of competing philosophies: corporate efficiency versus individual craftsmanship, institutional authority versus personal expertise, the safety of established procedures versus the possibility of discovering better ways to accomplish necessary work. Eleanor, who had been watching this confrontation with the intensity of someone monitoring a chess match between grand masters, chose this moment to offer her own perspective. "You know," she said, her voice carrying the conversational tone of someone making casual observations, "in my experience, the people who talk the most about protocols and procedures are usually the ones who use them as excuses for not taking responsibility when things go wrong." The comment hit David like a physical blow, and Marcus could see him struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't make him sound defensive or petty. But before he could speak, Victoria was already moving toward the helicopter, her expression focused and determined. "Rodriguez," she said, addressing the recovery team leader directly, "what would it cost to have your equipment remain on standby for 72 hours while we conduct a thorough damage assessment? Not working, just available in case we need to proceed with recovery." Rodriguez considered the question with the calculating expression of someone whose livelihood depended on understanding the economics of complicated situations. "Standby rate is $2,000 a day, plus crew expenses. Call it $7,000 for 3 days, assuming you make a decision by Friday afternoon." "Done," Victoria said, without hesitation, her voice carrying a finality that indicated the negotiation was over. She looked at David with the expression of someone who'd just solved a problem everyone else had been making unnecessarily complicated. "Victoria, that's not how corporate aviation works. We have protocols, procedures, insurance requirements, regulatory compliance issues. You can't just decide to have a $12 million aircraft repaired in someone's backyard workshop." But Marcus was already turning away from him. Her attention focused on Marcus with the intensity that made his pulse quicken. "How long do you need to give me a complete assessment of the damage and a realistic estimate of repair costs and timelines?" she asked, her voice carrying the expectant tone of someone who'd already decided to trust his answer.
Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that always accompanied the moment when a challenging project shifted from possibility to commitment. 48 hours, he said without hesitation. his mind already organizing the sequence of inspections and evaluations that would be required. Maybe less if the damage is as straightforward as it appears, maybe a little more if I find complications, but by Thursday evening I'll be able to tell you exactly what's broken, what it'll take to fix it, and what the whole project will cost. The handshake they exchanged felt like more than just a business agreement. It was a mutual recognition of shared competence, complementary skills, and the kind of trust that developed between people who understood the difference between taking calculated risks and being reckless. Marcus had worked with enough pilots over the years to recognize the type, professionals who understood that flying was ultimately about managing complex systems under challenging conditions. People who appreciated the difference between genuine expertise and impressive credentials. As Rodriguez and his crew began the process of securing their equipment for an extended standby period, and David retreated to his SUV to make what were obviously going to be difficult phone calls to corporate headquarters, Marcus found himself alone with Victoria for the first time since the morning of the crash. The workshop felt different now, charged with possibility and shared purpose in ways that transformed the familiar space into something entirely new. "You realize," Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of exhilaration mixed with apprehension, "that we've just committed ourselves to something that could go spectacularly wrong." She looked at the helicopter wreckage, then at Marcus, her green eyes bright with the kind of excitement that came from stepping off well-marked paths into uncharted territory. Marcus smiled, feeling more energized than he had in years. "Yes," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent his life proving that spectacular results often emerged from situations that looked impossible to outside observers. But it could also go spectacularly right, and personally, I'm getting tired of playing it safe. As the afternoon sun slanted through the workshop windows, illuminating the helicopter wreckage and the two people who'd decided to bet their futures on its resurrection, something fundamental had shifted in the small universe that existed within the boundaries of Marcus Chen's property. The question was no longer whether the helicopter could be repaired, but what would be born from the collaboration between a disillusioned pilot who'd rediscovered her purpose and a small-town mechanic who was finally ready to prove what he was truly capable of achieving. The revelation came at 2:17 in the morning, 3 days into what had become the most intensive investigation of Marcus's career. He'd been working by the light of shop floods and a borrowed surgical headlamp, carefully documenting every stress fracture, every worn bearing, every component that told the story of systematic maintenance neglect. Victoria had insisted on staying to observe the process, claiming she needed to understand exactly what had failed and why. But Marcus suspected her real motivation was the same compulsive fascination that kept him working through the night. The need to understand how something so preventable had been allowed to progress to near catastrophe. The smoking gun was hidden beneath a protective cover plate that had been painted over so many times it had become nearly impossible to remove. When Marcus finally managed to work it loose with penetrating oil and careful prying, the evidence was undeniable. Metal shavings embedded in dried grease, stress cracks that had been filled with body compound and painted over, and bearing races that showed the distinctive wear patterns of components that had been running hot for months. This wasn't routine wear and tear. This was deliberate concealment of known problems. "Victoria," he said with the quiet intensity of someone who just uncovered something significant, "you need to see this."
She moved to his shoulder, and Marcus was acutely aware of her warmth in the cool workshop air, the subtle scent of her shampoo mixing with the familiar smells of oil and metal. When she leaned in to examine what he discovered, her hair brushed against his cheek, sending an unexpected jolt of electricity through his nervous system. For just a moment, the technical revelation took second place to the personal one. He was falling for this woman who'd crashed into his life with the same dramatic impact as her helicopter. "My God," Victoria breathed, her voice carrying a mixture of vindication and anger as she processed what the evidence revealed. They knew. They absolutely knew this was failing, and they covered it up rather than grounding the aircraft for proper repairs. Her hands were shaking slightly as she used her phone's flashlight to document the concealed damage, taking photos that would serve as evidence in what was obviously going to become a much larger investigation. The cover-up was sophisticated enough to fool routine inspections, but crude enough to be obvious once someone looked closely. Body compound mixed with metallic paint to hide stress cracks, grease fittings that had been packed with heavy lubricant to mask the grinding sounds of failing bearings, maintenance logbooks that showed routine inspections and replacements that clearly hadn't been performed. It painted a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond simple cost-cutting or corner-cutting. "How long do you think this has been going on?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the layers of concealment and the progression of damage he'd been documenting. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her mind obviously processing implications that went far beyond her own aircraft. "Since David took over operations," she said finally, her voice carrying the bitter tone of someone whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. "Maybe longer. He's been pushing the maintenance department to reduce costs, extend service intervals, find ways to keep aircraft flying instead of grounding them for proper care. You realize what this means, don't you? This isn't just about one helicopter. If they're covering up problems like this, there are probably other aircraft in the fleet with similar issues." The implications were staggering. Marcus had uncovered evidence of maintenance fraud in a company that operated dozens of aircraft carrying passengers throughout the Pacific Northwest. Every flight represented potential tragedy. Every covered-up problem was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The helicopter crash that had brought Victoria into his life had been prevented from becoming fatal only by her skill as a pilot and pure luck in terms of where the failure had occurred. "We need to document everything," Marcus said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood they were now dealing with issues far larger than a simple repair project. "Every component, every cover-up, every piece of evidence that shows this was deliberate, and we need to contact the FAA investigative unit, probably the FBI as well if this is as systematic as it appears." Victoria nodded, but her expression was troubled by considerations that went far beyond her own aircraft. "Marcus, you need to understand what we're getting into. David Sterling isn't just some incompetent manager. His family has been in aviation for 3 generations. They have connections throughout the industry, influence with regulatory agencies, relationships with people who can make our lives very difficult." Her voice carried the weight of someone who dealt with corporate power before and understood its reach. "Once we blow the whistle on this, there's no going back. They'll come after both of us with everything they have."
But Marcus had made his decision the moment he'd uncovered the first piece of concealed damage. "Good," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet determination of someone whose moral code didn't include exceptions for powerful opponents. "Let them come. I've got documentation, photographs and physical evidence of criminal negligence that nearly killed you and could kill other people if it's not stopped." He looked directly at Victoria, his expression resolute. Some things are more important than playing it safe. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation, not the diesel rumble of recovery equipment this time, but the smooth purr of expensive sedans moving through the pre-dawn darkness. Marcus checked his watch, wondering who would be arriving at his workshop at nearly 3 in the morning, but Victoria's expression had already provided the answer. Her face had gone pale, her hands clenching into fists as she recognized the distinctive sound of David Sterling's corporate fleet. "He's not alone," Victoria said, her voice tight with apprehension as multiple car doors slammed in the darkness beyond the workshop lights. David doesn't travel with an entourage unless he's planning something serious. I think our timeline just accelerated dramatically. The group that entered the workshop moved with the coordinated efficiency of a corporate strike team. David Sterling led the way, flanked by two men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the predatory confidence of high-powered attorneys. Behind them came a woman Marcus didn't recognize. Her photographer's equipment and official demeanor suggested she was there to document whatever was about to happen. The final member of the group was wearing an FAA inspector's badge and carrying a briefcase that probably contained authority to shut down any aviation-related activity that didn't meet official approval. "Victoria," David said, his voice carrying a note of false concern that didn't quite mask the threat beneath. "When you didn't answer your phone, I was worried something might have happened." His eyes swept the workshop, taking in the scattered helicopter components, the detailed documentation Marcus had been preparing, and the obvious evidence of intensive investigation. "It looks like you've been very busy." Victoria straightened to her full height, her military bearing asserting itself in the face of obvious intimidation. "David, I wasn't expecting company at 3 in the morning. Is there something urgent that couldn't wait until business hours?" Her voice was coolly professional, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands remained steady despite what had to be significant stress. "Actually, yes," David replied, his corporate smile taking on a sharper edge. "It's come to our attention that unauthorized personnel have been conducting unauthorized inspections on company property." He gestured toward Marcus with the dismissive wave of someone swatting an annoying insect. "Mr. Chen here has been photographing and documenting proprietary maintenance procedures and engineering specifications without proper authorization or security clearance." One of the attorneys stepped forward, his voice carrying the precise diction of someone who made his living with carefully chosen words. "We're prepared to file charges for theft of trade secrets, industrial espionage, and interference with federal aviation regulations. Unless, of course, all documentation and photographs are turned over immediately and all parties agree to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements." Marcus felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach as he realized the sophistication of the trap he'd walked into. By conducting a thorough investigation of the helicopter's condition, by documenting evidence of maintenance fraud, he'd given David Sterling's legal team exactly the leverage they needed to silence him. Any evidence he'd gathered could be dismissed as the result of unauthorized access to proprietary information, and his attempts to expose safety violations could be reframed as industrial espionage motivated by malicious intent. But Victoria was already moving, her phone in her hand and her expression focused with the intensity of someone who'd found her footing in hostile territory. "Actually, David, I think you might want to reconsider that approach. Because while Marcus was documenting evidence of maintenance fraud, I was uploading copies of everything to a secure server maintained by my attorney." She held up her phone, its screen showing a file transfer that was nearly complete. "So, unless you want photos of concealed stress cracks and falsified maintenance records to end up in the hands of every aviation safety organization in the country, I suggest we discuss this situation like civilized adults."
The silence that followed was charged with the electricity of a standoff between opponents who'd each played what they believed to be winning cards. David's corporate confidence had developed visible cracks, his carefully planned intimidation campaign derailed by Victoria's unexpected preparation and Marcus's refusal to be frightened into silence. The attorneys were exchanging glances that suggested they were recalculating their legal strategy in light of evidence they hadn't expected to encounter. The FAA inspector, who had remained silent during the initial confrontation, finally stepped forward with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many disputes between corporate interests and safety concerns. "Miss Sterling, Mr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of federal regulatory power, "I'm Inspector Rodriguez with the Flight Standards District Office.
I'm here to conduct an official investigation into allegations of maintenance irregularities involving Sterling Aviation aircraft. He looked directly at David, his expression making it clear that this was no longer a private corporate matter. Mr. Sterling, I'll need to examine your maintenance records for this aircraft, as well as any documentation related to recent inspections and repairs. David's face had gone pale, the color draining from his features as he realized that his intimidation campaign had backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing potential whistleblowers, his heavy-handed tactics had attracted exactly the kind of official attention he'd been trying to avoid. "Inspector Rodriguez," he said, his voice taking on the desperate tone of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his influence. "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of this situation. We're dealing with a routine post-accident investigation, and any irregularities in documentation are simply the result of administrative oversights rather than deliberate violations." But Inspector Rodriguez was already examining the components Marcus had laid out for documentation, his trained eye immediately recognizing the signs of concealed damage and fraudulent repairs that David had been hoping to keep hidden. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone delivering unwelcome news, "what I'm seeing here goes far beyond administrative oversights. This appears to be systematic falsification of maintenance records, concealment of known safety defects, and deliberate circumvention of federal aviation regulations." He looked up from his examination, his expression grave. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ground your entire fleet pending a comprehensive investigation of your maintenance procedures." The words hit David like physical blows, each one representing millions of dollars in lost revenue and potential criminal liability that could destroy both his career and his family's company. Marcus watched the man's corporate arrogance crumble in real time, replaced by the desperate panic of someone who'd bet everything on a strategy that had just collapsed catastrophically. "You can't do that," he said, his voice rising to a pitch that suggested he was losing his grip on both the situation and his composure. "Sterling Aviation has been operating safely for 40 years. One aircraft malfunction doesn't justify shutting down our entire operation." He looked around the workshop as if searching for allies, his eyes finally settling on Victoria with an expression that combined accusation with betrayal. "David, this stopped being about a simple mechanical failure the moment Marcus found evidence that you've been covering up safety problems rather than fixing them." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "How many other pilots have reported problems that got ignored? How many passengers have been put at risk because fixing problems costs more than hiding them?" The question hung in the air like an accusation that demanded answers David Sterling was clearly unwilling to provide. Inspector Rodriguez was already on his radio, summoning additional investigators and coordinating what was obviously going to become a major federal investigation. The attorneys were huddled in urgent consultation, their expressions suggesting they were advising their client to stop talking before he said something that would make his legal situation even worse.
Marcus found himself at the center of a situation that had escalated far beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd agreed to assess the helicopter's damage. But as he looked at Victoria, at the way she'd stood her ground against corporate intimidation, the courage she'd shown in choosing safety over career security, the trust she'd placed in his abilities when no one else would, he realized that some transformations were worth whatever chaos they created. "Inspector Rodriguez," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent the night documenting evidence that could save lives, "I have complete photographic documentation of every component failure, every concealed repair, every piece of evidence that shows this was systematic fraud rather than random mechanical failure." He gestured toward the organized array of parts and documentation that filled his workshop. "It's all yours, along with my full cooperation in whatever investigation needs to happen." The smile that crossed Victoria's face was radiant enough to light up the pre-dawn darkness, transforming her features and filling Marcus with a warmth that had nothing to do with the workshop's space heaters. In that moment, he realized that the helicopter crash had brought him more than just an interesting repair project. It had brought him a partner whose courage and integrity matched his own. Someone worth fighting alongside regardless of what challenges lay ahead. As federal investigators began the process of documenting evidence that would ultimately reshape aviation safety regulations and send multiple corporate executives to prison, Marcus Chen and Victoria Sterling stood together in the morning light, surrounded by the wreckage of a machine they'd transformed from symbol of near tragedy into catalyst for justice. The question was no longer whether the helicopter could be repaired, but what they would build together from the foundation of trust and shared purpose they'd discovered in the process of seeking truth. 6 months after the morning that changed everything, Marcus stood in the same workshop that had witnessed Victoria's dramatic arrival, but the space bore little resemblance to the modest repair facility it had been before. Federal grants for aviation safety research, combined with consulting contracts from manufacturers eager to avoid Sterling Aviation's fate, had transformed the building into a state-of-the-art facility that drew visitors from across the country. The helicopter itself, fully restored and bearing new registration numbers, sat in the center of the main bay like a metallic phoenix risen from the ashes of corporate corruption. Victoria emerged from the office they'd built together, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just closed another significant contract. Her pilot's uniform had been replaced by practical work clothes and a leather jacket that bore the logo of their new company, Integrity Aviation Services. The transformation from corporate pilot to business owner had suited her in ways that went beyond simple career change. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd finally found work that aligned with her values. The Montana Department of Transportation just approved our bid for the search and rescue contract, she announced, setting Marcus's coffee beside his computer where he'd been designing modifications for their latest client. 12 months, renewable for 5 years, full medical evacuation and wilderness rescue services for the entire northwestern region. Her smile was bright enough to illuminate the workshop. We're officially too busy to accept any more work this year. Marcus looked up from the engineering drawings that had occupied his morning, modifications to improve safety systems on a fleet of aging emergency services helicopters. The irony wasn't lost on him that his reputation for exposing maintenance fraud had led to more business than he'd ever imagined possible. Insurance companies now required his safety inspections, manufacturers sought his consulting on design improvements, and pilots throughout the region trusted him with aircraft they considered irreplaceable. You realize that we're going to have to hire actual employees soon. This operation is getting too big for just the 2 of us and Eleanor's bookkeeping services. Eleanor Patterson had become their unofficial office manager, handling correspondence and scheduling with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing her husband's medical practice. Her guest room had been converted into Victoria's permanent residence, an arrangement that had evolved naturally from temporary necessity to comfortable domesticity. The 3 of them had formed an unlikely family unit, bound together by shared purpose and mutual affection that transcended conventional definitions of household or workplace relationships.
Actually, Victoria said, settling onto the stool beside Marcus's workbench with the easy familiarity of months of shared labor, I've been thinking about that. There's a young pilot I met at the Aviation Safety Conference last month, former military, excellent skills, looking for work that matters more than just transportation. She paused, her expression taking on the thoughtful quality that Marcus had learned to associate with carefully considered proposals. And I heard through industry channels that there's an experienced mechanic in Spokane who's getting tired of corporate aviation politics. The suggestion carried implications that went beyond simple business expansion. Marcus and Victoria had been dancing around the obvious attraction between them for months, their relationship deepening through shared work and common purpose, while remaining carefully professional. They'd developed the easy partnership of people who complemented each other's strengths, but the question of what else might be possible between them remained unspoken, hanging in the air like a promise neither had quite found the courage to voice. Hiring employees means commitment, Marcus observed, his voice carrying layers of meaning that had nothing to do with business considerations. It means believing this partnership is going to last, that we're building something permanent rather than just responding to immediate opportunities. Victoria's green eyes held his gaze with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. The same look she'd given him that first morning when she'd asked if he believed the helicopter could fly again. "Marcus," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking about a lot of things lately, about what it means to find work that feels like purpose instead of just obligation, about what it's like to work with someone who shares your values instead of just your schedule." She paused, color rising in her cheeks as she prepared to voice what they'd both been thinking for months, about what it might feel like to build a life with someone instead of just building a business. The words hung in the air between them, laden with possibility and vulnerability in equal measure. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as he realized they'd finally reached the moment they'd been approaching since that first morning when she'd crashed into his life with all the subtlety of a falling star. The workshop around them, filled with evidence of their shared accomplishments and future plans, seemed to hold its breath as well, waiting to see what would emerge from this moment of truth. "Victoria," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion he'd been keeping carefully controlled, "I need you to know that working with you has been the best thing that's happened to me in years. Not just professionally, but personally. You challenge me, inspire me, make me want to be better than I thought I was capable of being." He reached for her hands, feeling the calluses that had developed from months of working alongside him. "I've been afraid to say anything because I didn't want to complicate what we've built together, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just professional respect." Victoria's smile was radiant, transforming her features and filling the workshop with warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sunshine streaming through the windows. "Marcus Chen," she said, her voice carrying a note of exhilaration that spoke of barriers finally being breached. "Are you asking me out on a date? Because I should probably mention that I've been hoping you would for about 5 months now." The laughter that escaped Marcus was pure relief mixed with joy, the sound of tension finally released after months of careful restraint. "Actually," he said, his voice taking on the confident tone he used when proposing ambitious repair projects, "I was thinking about something a little more comprehensive than a date. I was thinking about building a life together, creating something permanent, maybe even getting married someday if you're interested in that kind of commitment." Victoria stared at him for a moment, her expression cycling through surprise, delight, and something approaching wonder, before settling on the kind of happiness that transforms ordinary moments into memories that last forever. "Marcus," she said, her voice soft with emotion, "are you proposing to me in the middle of your workshop, surrounded by helicopter parts and coffee-stained engineering drawings?" "Well," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the mock-serious tone that had become one of their private jokes, "it seems appropriate, considering this is where we met, where we built our business, where we discovered we make a pretty good team." He gestured around the workshop that had become the center of their shared world. "Besides, I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be when I ask the most important question of my life."
The kiss that followed was tender and passionate and full of promise, tasting of coffee and possibility, and the kind of happiness that comes from finding exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard and grinning like teenagers who just discovered something wonderful about themselves and each other. "So," Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of practical curiosity that made Marcus fall in love with her all over again, "when you say married someday, are we talking about a..." Marcus laughed, pulling her closer and marveling at how perfectly she fit against his shoulder. "Well, I was thinking we should probably make it official before we hire those employees. Eleanor has been dropping hints about wanting to plan a wedding, and I suspect she's got ideas about catering and flowers that we're going to want to accommodate." Eleanor's been planning our wedding since about a week after I moved into her guest room, Victoria confirmed, her voice warm with affection for the woman who'd become their unofficial guardian angel. She's got sample invitations hidden in her kitchen drawer and a guest list that includes half the county. I think she's been waiting for us to catch up with what she considered obvious from the beginning. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway interrupted their conversation, and Marcus looked up to see a familiar pickup truck pulling into the parking area. The vehicle belonged to Tom Rodriguez, the recovery team leader who'd become an unexpected ally during the federal investigation. His company had pivoted from simple aircraft recovery to specialized safety consulting, and he'd become one of their most reliable partners for complex projects. "Marcus, Victoria," Tom called as he approached the workshop, his weathered face carrying the satisfied expression of someone with good news to share. "I just got word from the FAA investigative team. David Sterling accepted a plea bargain this morning. 5 years in federal prison, full restitution to affected parties, and permanent prohibition from any involvement in aviation operations." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "More importantly, the new safety regulations based on your recommendations are being implemented industry-wide next month." The news represented the final chapter in a story that had begun with near tragedy and evolved into systematic reform. The Sterling Aviation investigation exposed maintenance fraud at 17 different companies, led to criminal charges against 32 individuals, and resulted in safety improvements that would protect pilots and passengers for generations to come. Marcus and Victoria's decision to speak truth to power had created ripple effects far beyond anything they'd imagined possible. "What about the other pilots who lost their jobs when Sterling Aviation was shut down?" Victoria asked, her concern for her former colleagues evident in her voice. The company's collapse had displaced nearly 40 aviation professionals, and she'd been working with industry contacts to help them find positions with reputable operators. "Most of them have found work," Tom replied, his expression brightening. "Your recommendations carried a lot of weight with hiring managers. Turns out pilots who were willing to report safety concerns are exactly the kind of people responsible companies want on their payroll." He gestured toward the restored helicopter, its polished surfaces gleaming in the afternoon light. "Speaking of which, I heard through the grapevine that you're expanding operations. Any chance you might need an experienced logistics coordinator?" Victoria and Marcus exchanged glances, their silent communication reflecting months of developing the kind of partnership that transcended words. They'd discussed Tom's situation several times, recognizing that his combination of aviation knowledge and organizational skills would be valuable as their business continued to grow. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone who'd learned to trust his instincts about people, "we've been talking about bringing on someone to handle our increasing coordination requirements. The search and rescue contracts are getting complex enough that we need dedicated project management." He looked at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. "Interested in discussing terms and responsibilities?" Tom's smile was answer enough, but he managed to contain his enthusiasm long enough to maintain professional dignity. "Very interested. Though I should probably mention that my wife has been hoping we could relocate somewhere with better schools for our kids. Cedar Falls seems like exactly the kind of place we've been looking for."
The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor Patterson, who emerged from the house carrying a covered dish and wearing the expression of someone who'd been monitoring developments from her kitchen window. Her timing was either coincidental or the result of having developed an uncanny ability to appear whenever important conversations were reaching conclusion points. "Tom Rodriguez," she called, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone who considered all visitors to be potential family members. "I hope you're planning to stay for dinner. I made enough pot roast for an army, and Marcus and Victoria have some news they've been dying to share with someone." Marcus felt his face flush as he realized that Eleanor had somehow detected the change in their relationship status despite having been inside the house during their entire conversation. Victoria was laughing softly, her expression reflecting the kind of exasperated affection that came from dealing with someone whose intuitive abilities bordered on supernatural. "Eleanor," Victoria said, her voice carrying mock exasperation, have you been eavesdropping on our private conversations again? Honey, Eleanor replied with the serene confidence of someone who'd perfected the art of benevolent interference. I've been waiting for you two to figure out what was obvious to everyone else since about a week after you arrived. The only question was whether you'd make it official before or after Tom here joined the company. She looked at Tom with the knowing expression of someone who'd already planned the seating arrangements for his welcome dinner. I assume you'll be accepting their job offer? Tom was staring at the three of them with the bewildered expression of someone who'd walked into the middle of a play without knowing his lines. I'm sorry, he said, his voice carrying a note of confusion mixed with amusement, but did I miss something? Because 5 minutes ago, I was just stopping by to share some good news about David Sterling's plea bargain. Tom, Marcus said, his voice warm with the kind of happiness that came from having multiple pieces of his life fall into place simultaneously. Let me bring you up to speed. Victoria and I just got engaged. Eleanor has apparently been planning our wedding since before we knew we were interested in each other. And yes, we'd very much like you to join Integrity Aviation Services as our logistics coordinator. I paused, marveling at the absurdity of delivering so much life-changing information in a single sentence. Also, dinner is apparently ready whenever you are. The celebration that followed was exactly the kind of impromptu gathering that had become characteristic of their unusual family dynamic. Eleanor's pot roast was accompanied by stories of the investigation, plans for business expansion, and increasingly elaborate suggestions for wedding arrangements that somehow managed to incorporate both aviation themes and Eleanor's strong opinions about proper floral displays. As the evening progressed and Tom called his wife to discuss the possibility of relocating to Cedar Falls, Marcus found himself reflecting on the chain of events that had brought them all together. Victoria's helicopter crash had been the catalyst, but the real transformation had occurred through the relationships they'd built while working toward common goals. They'd discovered that integrity wasn't just about following rules or meeting standards. It was about choosing to do the right thing, even when it was difficult, expensive, or personally risky. You know, Victoria said, settling beside Marcus on the front steps of the workshop as the sun began to set behind the Cascade Mountains, 6 months ago, I thought my life was falling apart. Career going nowhere, working for people who didn't share my values, feeling like I was wasting my skills on meaningless transportation jobs. She leaned against her shoulder, her expression soft with contentment. Now I'm engaged to the most honest man I've ever met, running a business that actually matters, living in a community that feels like family. Marcus wrapped his arm around her, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side and how completely his life had been transformed by her unexpected arrival. I've been thinking about something, he said, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone she had learned to associate with his most important observations. Remember that first morning, when you asked if I thought the helicopter could fly again? I said yes because the bones were good, the frame was solid, and the engine just needed attention and prayer.
Victoria smiled, remembering the moment when she'd decided to trust a small-town mechanic with her crashed dreams and uncertain future. I remember. You said the worst that could happen was that it was already crashed. Well, Marcus continued, his voice warm with love and satisfaction, I think the same principle applies to people. Sometimes we crash. Sometimes we get damaged by circumstances beyond our control. Sometimes people we trust let us down or cover up problems instead of fixing them. He gestured toward the restored helicopter, then toward the workshop that had become the center of their shared world. But if the bones are good, if the foundation is solid, if there's enough love and attention and willingness to do the hard work of repair, almost anything can fly again. Victoria turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. Marcus Chen, she said, her voice soft with emotion. Are you telling me that you've been thinking of me as a repair project this whole time? Marcus laughed, pulling her closer and marveling at how she could make him feel simultaneously grounded and ready to soar. No, he said, his voice carrying all the love he'd been holding in his heart for months. I'm telling you that you've been thinking of yourself as broken when you were really just ready for transformation. The crash didn't destroy you, it brought you home. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Cedar Falls, and Eleanor called from the house that dessert was ready, and Tom finished his phone call with news that his family was excited about the possibility of a new adventure, Marcus and Victoria sat together in the place where their love story had begun. The helicopter that had brought them together gleamed in the workshop lights, ready for whatever missions lay ahead. The business they'd built together was thriving beyond their wildest expectations. The community that had embraced them both was preparing to welcome new members to their unconventional family. But most importantly, they discovered that sometimes the most beautiful flights begin with what looks like the worst possible crash, and that the strongest foundations are built by people who choose to trust each other with their broken pieces, confident that together they can create something magnificent from the wreckage of their separate pasts. 3 years later, on a crisp October morning that painted the Cascade Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus stood at the altar of Cedar Falls Community Church, wearing his grandfather's Navy dress uniform and trying not to fidget with his collar. The small church was packed with an eclectic gathering that perfectly represented the life he and Victoria had built together. Aviation professionals from across the Northwest, federal investigators who'd become personal friends, local farmers and business owners who'd watched their love story unfold with the invested interest of a community that claimed them as their own. The hat that defied gravity and conventional floral arrangement principles that Eleanor Patterson wore as her own unique officiant witness, alongside her friends from the opera theater, perfectly captured the essence of how their lives had intertwined with the unique and wonderful fabric of Cedar Falls community and beyond. The incredible friendship that Victoria had built with the local animal shelter and the grandmothers who donated time to take care of puppies, along with the fire chief who made sure they had a good evening time service counseling as the professionals formed by leading with the fire department ran to, led with music that instilled comfort, intertwined with phrases like love and beauty that becomes hope, and just as much as Eleanor Patterson taught kids with wisdom and grace, Marcus and Victoria were unassumingly sharing what has taught them throughout their lives. The ceremony itself was a reflection of everything they'd built together. Personal vows that spoke of shared purpose rather than romantic abstractions. Rings that had been designed by a local craftsman using metal salvaged from Victoria's original helicopter, and promises that acknowledged both the joy and the challenges of building a life with someone who shared your commitment to doing what was right, regardless of what was easy. "Marcus," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the emotion that sparkled in her green eyes, "you caught me when I was falling, fixed what was broken, and taught me that integrity isn't just about following rules. It's about choosing to do the right thing, even when it costs you something precious." She paused, her smile brightening as she continued. "You've shown me that love isn't just about finding someone who makes you happy, but finding someone who makes you want to be worthy of their trust, their partnership, their faith in your shared future." Marcus's own vows were delivered in the same straightforward style that had convinced Victoria to trust him with her crashed helicopter and her uncertain future. "Victoria, you've taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to do what's necessary despite being afraid. You've shown me that the most important repairs are the ones that happen in people's hearts, and that sometimes the best way to fix something is to trust someone else to help you rebuild it from scratch." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and passionate and full of promise, tasting of happiness and hope and the kind of love that comes from choosing each other every day rather than just falling into romantic accident. When they broke apart, the small church erupted in applause and cheers that could probably be heard 3 counties away. The reception that followed took place in Marcus's workshop, which had been transformed for the evening into something between rustic elegance and aviation museum. The restored helicopter, decorated with flowers and fairy lights, served as the centerpiece for a celebration that perfectly captured the unique community they'd helped create. Tables were arranged around aircraft parts that had been polished to mirror brightness, and the wedding cake was a three-tiered masterpiece shaped like a hangar with fondant helicopters that looked remarkably like the machine that had brought them together. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom Rodriguez announced, rising to deliver the best man speech with the confidence of someone who'd learned to handle complex logistics under pressure. 3 years ago, Marcus Chen was a bachelor mechanic living quietly in Cedar Falls, and Victoria Sterling was a corporate pilot going through the motions of a career that no longer fulfilled her. He paused, his expression growing more serious. Then, Victoria's helicopter crashed in Marcus's backyard, and their investigation of that crash uncovered corruption that led to federal prosecutions, industry-wide safety improvements, and the founding of a company that's become the gold standard for aviation integrity. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, acknowledging not just the personal happiness of the bride and groom, but the broader impact their partnership had created. Integrity Aviation Services now employed 15 people, operated a fleet of 6 aircraft, and had contracts throughout the Pacific Northwest for everything from emergency medical services to environmental monitoring. "But," Tom continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "what I've learned from working with Marcus and Victoria is that their real achievement isn't the business they've built, or the regulations they've helped improve, or even the lives they've saved through their work." He looked directly at the couple, his expression reflecting the deep respect that had developed through years of shared challenges. Their real achievement is proving that it's possible to build a life based on integrity rather than convenience, on service rather than profit, on love rather than settlement. The evening continued with dancing, stories, and the kind of celebration that comes from a community genuinely happy for two people who'd found each other and chosen to build something meaningful together. As the night progressed and last guests had begun to make their way home, Marcus and Victoria found themselves alone in the workshop that had been the setting for so many of their most important moments. "So," Victoria said, her voice carrying the playful tone that never failed to make Marcus's heart skip a beat, "what happens now? We've gotten married, built a successful business, changed an entire industry's approach to safety regulation. What's our next adventure?" The discussion that followed lasted through dinner, into the evening, and continued sporadically over the following weeks as they explored the implications of national expansion. In the end, their decision was guided by the same principles that had governed all their major choices. Would the opportunity allow them to do meaningful work? Would it strengthen rather than strain their family relationships? Would it advance their mission of improving aviation safety while maintaining the integrity that had defined their approach from the beginning?
"Good news," she announced, settling beside Marcus to review the day's operational summary. "The insurance company approved our proposal for the Alaska Wilderness contract, and the State Environmental Agency wants to discuss expanding our wildlife monitoring program to include the entire Pacific coast." She glanced at Elena, who was clearly listening to adult business conversations with the intense interest of someone planning her future involvement. "Also, Elena, I scheduled our first college visit for the weekend after your birthday. MIT wants to meet with prospective students who have practical aviation experience." Elena's excitement was visible, her composure finally cracking to reveal the enthusiastic teenager beneath her professional facade. "MIT? Really? They want to meet with me specifically?" Her voice carried the wonder of someone discovering that her childhood dreams might actually be achievable through hard work and family support. "They want to meet with the daughter of Marcus and Victoria Chen Sterling," Victoria corrected gently, her voice carrying the parental wisdom of someone who'd learned to balance encouragement with realistic expectations. "But you'll have to prove yourself based on your own merits, not your family connections." David looked up from his inspection checklist, his expression reflecting the practical curiosity that defined his approach to most situations. If Elena goes to MIT, can I have her helicopter simulation software? She never lets me use the advanced flight planning programs. The family discussion that followed was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Rodriguez, who'd evolved from logistics coordinator to company vice president over the past decade. His own children had grown up alongside Marcus and Victoria's, creating an extended family network that included employees, their families, and what seemed like half the population of Cedar Falls. "Marcus, Victoria," Tom said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone with genuinely important news to share. "I just got off the phone with the FAA administrator. They want to present you with the Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award at next month's Aviation Safety Conference." He paused, clearly enjoying the opportunity to deliver recognition that was long overdue. It's the highest honor they give for contributions to aviation safety, and they're specifically citing your work in exposing maintenance fraud and developing industry-wide integrity standards. The award represented official acknowledgement of what their industry colleagues had recognized for years, that Marcus and Victoria's partnership had fundamentally changed how aviation companies approached safety, maintenance, and corporate responsibility. The investigation of David Sterling's fraudulent practices had led to regulatory changes that had prevented countless accidents and saved hundreds of lives. "The ceremony's in Washington, D.C., Tom continued, his expression taking on the practical focus of someone who'd spent years coordinating complex logistics. Black tie dinner, federal officials, industry leaders, the whole prestigious event treatment. Eleanor has already started planning what she's going to wear and making lists of people she wants to meet." Marcus and Victoria exchanged glances, their silent communication reflecting years of shared decision-making and mutual understanding. The award was an honor they'd never expected and probably didn't deserve any more than dozens of other safety professionals who worked every day to keep people alive in an inherently dangerous industry. "We accept," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to receive recognition gracefully while keeping it in proper perspective. "But only if the entire team can attend. This award belongs to everyone who's contributed to what we've built here, not just to Marcus and me." As the afternoon progressed and the family gathered for their traditional end-of-day meeting in the main hangar, Marcus found himself reflecting on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Victoria's helicopter crash was the catalyst that changed both their lives, but the real transformation had occurred through the choices they'd made in response to crisis, choosing integrity over convenience, service over profit, love over safety. "You know," Victoria said, settling beside Marcus on the steps of their original workshop, which had been preserved as a historical landmark and company memorial, "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd crashed somewhere else that morning. If I'd made it to the hospital, filed a routine incident report, let the insurance company handle everything according to standard procedures." Marcus wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close while watching their children conduct their final equipment checks with the kind of precision that came from growing up in an environment where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. "I think," he said, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone she'd learned to associate with his most important observations, "that you would have found another way to discover what you were really capable of achieving. The crash didn't create your integrity or your courage. It just provided circumstances that revealed what was already there." Eleanor appeared from the main office carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose day had been filled with purposeful activity and family connections. At 83, she moved with the careful precision of someone whose physical abilities had diminished, but whose mental acuity remained sharp enough to manage complex scheduling and keep track of multiple grandchildren's activities simultaneously. "Children," she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinions were considered binding by all concerned parties. "Dinner is ready, and we have some important news to discuss." She settled beside Marcus and Victoria, her expression taking on the mysterious quality that usually indicated she'd been planning something significant without consulting anyone else. "I've been corresponding with my cousin Margaret in Seattle, and she's mentioned that her grandson is a very nice young man who happens to be studying aeronautical engineering at the University of Washington." Elena looked up from her equipment checklist, her expression reflecting the mixture of horror and resignation that came from recognizing one of Eleanor's matchmaking campaigns in its early stages. "Grandma Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd been dealing with benevolent interference for 16 years. "I'm not interested in meeting anyone right now. I'm focused on my education and career preparation." "Of course, dear," Eleanor replied, with the serene confidence of someone whose plans operated on timelines that transcended immediate objectives. "But it never hurts to make professional connections with people who share your interests. Margaret's grandson is very serious about aviation safety, and he's working on a research project about composite materials that might interest you." Marcus and Victoria exchanged amused glances, recognizing the familiar pattern of Eleanor's strategic thinking and her ability to frame romantic interference as professional networking. Their own love story had benefited from her intervention at crucial moments, and they'd learned to trust her instincts about which relationships were worth encouraging. As the family gathered for dinner in the house Eleanor had built overlooking their expanded operations, Marcus found himself grateful for the chaos, the complications, and the unexpected blessings that had emerged from what had initially seemed like a simple helicopter repair project. They'd built something lasting from the wreckage of Victoria's crash, not just a successful business, but a family, a community, and a legacy of integrity that would influence aviation safety for generations to come. The question was no longer what would happen next, but how many more lives would be touched by the ripple effects of two people who'd chosen to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost. As the evening progressed and stories were shared around the dinner table, as plans were made for college visits and award ceremonies and the countless small decisions that shaped their daily lives, Marcus and Victoria knew that their greatest achievement wasn't the company they'd built or the recognition they'd received. Their greatest achievement was proving that love and integrity weren't obstacles to success. They were the foundation upon which all meaningful success was built, the secret ingredients that transformed ordinary work into extraordinary purpose, the forces that turned a chance encounter into a lifetime partnership that made both of them more than they could have been alone.
"Actually," Victoria said, settling onto the stool beside Marcus's workbench with the easy familiarity of months of shared labor, "I've been thinking about that. There's a young pilot I met at the Aviation Safety Conference last month. Former military, excellent skills, looking for work that matters more than just transportation." She paused, her expression taking on the thoughtful quality that Marcus had learned to associate with carefully considered proposals. "And I heard through industry channels that there's an experienced mechanic in Spokane who's getting tired of corporate aviation politics." The suggestion carried implications that went beyond simple business expansion. Marcus and Victoria had been dancing around the obvious attraction between them for months, their relationship deepening through shared work and common purpose, while remaining carefully professional. They'd developed the easy partnership of people who complemented each other's strengths, but the question of what else might be possible between them remained unspoken, hanging in the air like a promise neither had quite found the courage to voice. "Hiring employees means commitment," Marcus observed, his voice carrying layers of meaning that had nothing to do with business considerations. "It means believing this partnership is going to last, that we're building something permanent rather than just responding to immediate opportunities." Victoria's green eyes held his gaze with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. The same look she'd given him that first morning when she'd asked if he believed the helicopter could fly again. "Marcus," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking about a lot of things lately, about what it means to find work that feels like purpose instead of just obligation, about what it's like to work with someone who shares your values instead of just your schedule." She paused, color rising in her cheeks as she prepared to voice what they'd both been thinking for months, about what it might feel like to build a life with someone instead of just building a business. The words hung in the air between them, laden with possibility and vulnerability in equal measure.
Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as he realized they'd finally reached the moment they'd been approaching since that first morning when she'd crashed into his life with all the subtlety of a falling star. The workshop around them, filled with evidence of their shared accomplishments and future plans, seemed to hold its breath as well, waiting to see what would emerge from this moment of truth. "Victoria," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion he'd been keeping carefully controlled, "I need you to know that working with you has been the best thing that's happened to me in years. Not just professionally, but personally. You challenge me, inspire me, make me want to be better than I thought I was capable of being." He reached for her hands, feeling the calluses that had developed from months of working alongside him. "I've been afraid to say anything because I didn't want to complicate what we've built together, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just professional respect." Victoria's smile was radiant, transforming her features and filling the workshop with warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sunshine streaming through the windows. "Marcus Chen," she said, her voice carrying a note of exhilaration that spoke of barriers finally being breached. "Are you asking me out on a date? Because I should probably mention that I've been hoping you would for about 5 months now." The laughter that escaped Marcus was pure relief mixed with joy, the sound of tension finally released after months of careful restraint. "Actually," he said, his voice taking on the confident tone he used when proposing ambitious repair projects, "I was thinking about something a little more comprehensive than a date. I was thinking about building a life together, creating something permanent, maybe even getting married someday if you're interested in that kind of commitment." Victoria stared at him for a moment, her expression cycling through surprise, delight, and something approaching wonder, before settling on the kind of happiness that transforms ordinary moments into memories that last forever. "Marcus," she said, her voice soft with emotion, "are you proposing to me in the middle of your workshop, surrounded by helicopter parts and coffee-stained engineering drawings?" "Well," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the mock-serious tone that had become one of their private jokes, "it seems appropriate, considering this is where we met, where we built our business, where we discovered we make a pretty good team." He gestured around the workshop that had become the center of their shared world. "Besides, I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be when I ask the most important question of my life." Marcus nodded, his throat still tight with grief for the woman who'd shaped their family's destiny through sheer force of personality and unwavering commitment to everyone else's welfare. "She was already planning the memorial service, you know," he said, his voice carrying the mixture of sadness and amusement that came from dealing with Eleanor's legendary organizational abilities. "I found detailed instructions in her desk drawer, including suggested menus, seating arrangements, and a list of people who should be asked to speak." The laughter that escaped Victoria's lips was exactly what Eleanor would have expected, the sound of people choosing joy over sorrow, celebration over mourning, gratitude for shared memories over regret for what was lost. Eleanor had taught them that grief was best honored through continued living, that the proper response to loss was redoubled commitment to the values and relationships that gave life meaning. "Dad," Elena called from across the hangar, her voice carrying the practical authority she'd inherited from both parents. "The Foundation Board wants to discuss establishing the first scholarship program. Should we schedule a meeting for next week?" The transition was seamless, from memorial service to business planning, from honoring Eleanor's memory to continuing her work, from acknowledging what had been lost to committing to what would be built in her honor. It was exactly how Eleanor would have wanted her legacy to unfold, with maximum efficiency and minimum time wasted on sentiment that didn't translate into practical action. As the afternoon progressed and the last visitors began to make their way home, Marcus and Victoria found themselves alone in the hangar where so many of their most important conversations had taken place. The helicopter gleamed in the late sunlight, its polished surfaces reflecting the memorial flowers that had been arranged around its base by people who understood its symbolic importance to their family's story. 21 years, Victoria said, her voice soft with reflection as she traced the memorial plaque that honored Eleanor's contribution to their love story. 21 years since I crashed into your backyard and started the most important relationship of my life." Marcus pulled her closer, marveling as always at how perfectly she fit against his shoulder and how completely their partnership had evolved from dramatic beginning through all the challenges and triumphs that had followed. Eleanor always said that the best love stories began with unexpected crashes. Victoria smiled through her tears, remembering the woman who had guided their love story from the very beginning. She was right, wasn't she? About everything. Marcus nodded, pulling her close as they stood together in the hangar where their adventure had begun. The crash brought you to me, the investigation brought us together, and Eleanor made sure we didn't waste the opportunity. "And now?" Victoria asked, looking around at the legacy they'd built, the thriving business, their wonderful children, the lives they'd saved through their work. "Now we keep flying. Together, just like she always knew we would." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Marcus and Victoria Chen Sterling stood hand in hand, grateful for the crash that had brought them together and the love that had carried them through everything that followed.